Well, with the languages, I grew up with the languages. My father is German, my mother is from South America, from Uruguay. And as a child, we moved a lot together with my parents because they moved just from one location to the next. And this then resulted in the necessity to quickly not only learn the language, but the whole code that's linked to it, you know, the cultural code.
You know, the idiosyncrasies, as the British call them, for example. So it's not just learning the language, but also being able to submerge into the language like a fish in water. So the relationship I have to the languages that I speak comes from these personal remembrances of when I was a child. And it's a very emotional issue as well. Spanish was my first language. My mother spoke Spanish to me when I was a child.
Language is not just an instrument, but it is an emotional link, really, a very strong emotional link. And that is why it's very important for me that I always situate myself in between. It used to be the case that wherever I was, according to where I would sometimes present myself in Germany, for example, as a Belgian, or even as a Uruguayan from time to time.
But when you're an interpreter, sometimes, or always, you have to bear in mind that you're not in there on your own. You're working with somebody else. Your counterparty doesn't really perceive you. I mean, if there's a speaker downstairs in the ICC, in the conference hall, and they're on stage, they don't see you watch them. And it's not like a noise or a voice coming from outer space and speaking to you.
It's rather like I try to capture, I try to grasp what a person wants to say. I also try to kind of feel empathy with the psyche of a speaker. So I step back and I'm in a kind of abstract position and I try to hear and I have to understand, hermeneutically that is.
From this kind of understanding, then the process of interpreting starts. And these are, of course, very quick processes that are taking place. And this is also the absurd thing about interpreting, that this thing can actually work out like that. That in fragments of a second, you actually understand what a person has to say or what they are intending to say. And there is this input, then there is understanding, and then there is the output. And it is a balance. It's a balance that really where you are moving slightly all the time. I mean, it also becomes quite clear when you look at the movement some interpreters make. I mean, there are interpreters who just lower their head and can't just look out of their windows in order to enable them to undertake this process. But it's always a physical thing.
And after half an hour, we have to swap over because there's such a lot of adrenaline flowing through our veins, and it's also the case that a certain amount of fatigue enters into it. You can't control yourself anymore. You know, controlling your output, editing, if you like, your output, checking the plausibility of what you've just said, and where necessary, correcting what you've just said. This sort of stops working so well because your body becomes so tired and you get so fatigued that you just have to have a break after half an hour or so.
It's something that in philosophy and phenomenology has been time and again mentioned. Levinas, for example, or German philosophers such as Waldenfels constantly point to the fact that things are put to words, that things arrive at being expressed, that this is always also to do with the other, that as we speak, we were actually spoken to before we expressed ourselves in language.
Like a mother talks to her child. So there are always two people, and you have the ego and you have the other, and you have a situation in which it's not as clear anymore. You cannot really draw a line anymore. And that's why I think it's a good metaphor for what takes place when you interpret. Interpreting means I, myself, and the other are there at the same time, simultaneously.
We're both involved in the language that results, so we both get a chance to speak, as it were. You have to have all your sensitivity and all your attention, your intuitiveness, if you like, all focused on this situation in order to really properly interpret it and to do justice to this person, to serve this person, to do justice to what they're saying. and to ensure that the other is also reflected in my voice. It's always the case that it's not an exact copy. You know, there is a certain amount of interpreting going into interpretation. This doesn't mean that I have to incorporate all of their ums and ahs. It doesn't have to be every exact word, but I do have to try and get across this sort of direction that the person's thoughts are going in and make them my own.
Well, originally I was born in the Rhine area. My stepmother is English, my mother is from Finland, and then there is a difference with a view to bilingual upbringing. There are researchers who say that there is a difference whether you start learning a second language from the 8th year on, or whether you're being born into such a surrounding.
I'm a compound bilingual. I was 8 years old when I started speaking English at home. Before that I only spoke German, and there are various theories about this. They say that people who are compound bilinguals supposedly interpret better because they say you need to have one mother tongue to be completely at home at, whereas these absolute bilinguals have two languages and don't have a 100% feeling of being at home.
I read about a South American who had grown up in a bilingual environment with Dutch parents, and he spoke Dutch, and then he traveled to the Netherlands for the first time at age 21 or so. And then he started speaking with an accent because he wanted to underline that he did not belong to the Dutch culture.
1.7 by 2 meters, it's a very small box, and you're two people there, and sometimes it takes about 8 hours to do an interpretation job. And sometimes if somebody speaks in a very cumbersome language, then maybe that's deliberate. You cannot not communicate, and if they go off on 5 tangents, maybe you should copy 5 tangents.
And I don't think that there is the role of the interpreter. Some people have also a level of trying to get things onto an abstract level. They have a very level voice and they don't really try to use too much emphasis. So it is a very nice feeling if you have this kind of flow, if everything really is flowing out, then you just know where the speaker, for example, is heading to, and you can just swim along.
Interpreter is the term, isn't it? Interprète in French, whereas the German word is Dolmetschen, which comes from the Turkish. I think we're interpreters first and foremost.